So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Diana Kapaszewski, an associate professor of government here at Georgetown and currently director of the Center for Latin American Studies. Democratic backsliding is ongoing in many countries in the Americas, as we know, here in the United States and across the hemisphere. We often think of other regime dynamics, of these and other regime dynamics being directed by the actions of government officials and presidents in particular, given the overwhelming nature of executives in government and politics in the Americas. But social movements and other societal actors, as well as international forces, can also significantly influence regime trajectories in ways that support democracy and in ways that undermine it. So today's event, which is organized by the Georgetown Americas Institute and the Georgetown Center for Latin American Studies, is focused on these two critical dynamics. And the event is one aspect of a broader GAI class joint research initiative on democracy in the Americas that's seeking to sort of understand the dynamics and the contours and the consequences of democratic backsliding in the Americas. We're delighted to have with us today a wonderful panel of speakers who will take on these crucial questions. What is driving and who is resisting democratic backsliding in the Americas? I will introduce each of our speakers only very briefly. Their full bios are on the GAI website if you would like to know more. To begin, we are absolutely delighted to welcome Thomas Carothers, who will offer some opening remarks to get us started. Mr. Carothers is director of the Carnegie Endowment's Democracy, Conflict, and Governance Program and a leading authority on comparative democratization and international support for democracy, human rights, and governance, and the rule of law and civil society. After Mr. Carothers' opening remarks, a faculty panel will react and comment. Again, we are thrilled to welcome these faculty and to have them with us here today. Nicolas Diep is a senior research professor in the history division of the Center for Economic and Research and Teaching, better known as CIDE, in Mexico, and a professor at the College of Latin American Studies, at the Universidad, in the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. He also coordinates the Seminario Permanente Interinstitucional Juventudes y Movimientos Estudiantiles. Janice Gallagher is an associate professor of political science at Rutgers University, Newark, and director of research at the Sheila Y. Oliver Center for Politics and Race in the Americas. Her work examines Latin American politics, social movements, human rights, and everyday citizenship, informed by more than 2 decades of collaborative research with movements in Mexico and Colombia. Alvaro Santos is professor of law and Fleming Research Professor and has served as faculty director of the Center for the Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas, Carolla, at Georgetown Law. His teaching and research focus on international trade, economic development, transnational labor law, and drug policy. And finally, Kenzo Suarez Seto is a resident fellow at the Information Society Project at Yale Law and a fellow at the Institute for the Cooperative Development Digital Economy at the New School. Previously, he worked for 10 years as an advisor at the municipal and state levels in Rio de Janeiro and in the Brazilian National Congress, helping strengthen dialogue between civil society and legislators. He's also co-founder of a youth movement in Brazil that was born out of the 2013 social protests. And finally, our moderator today is Michael Shifter, who is an adjunct professor in the Center for Latin American Studies here at Georgetown and who formerly served as president of the Inter-American Dialogue. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful panel.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Diana, for those introductions, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this panel. And I'm really very, very happy to serve as a moderator, and particularly honored and delighted at a very personal level to have with us today Tom Carothers, who is a very good friend and colleague, who we've been partners in crime at many moments during my time at the Inter-American Dialogue and with Tom at Carnegie. And really, there's nobody around who has thought about and written as lucidly and as cogently about these issues of democratic backsliding and what it means, as Tom has. And he really has, I think, set the agenda for this whole topic. So it's a great honor and privilege to have him with us today, and to hear his perspective on where things stand right now, how he sees the field, what are the issues, and try to look at it, take us out of our Latin American kind of context and look at this in a wider perspective globally. I think that's extremely important. Sometimes we just kind of look at our region without a sort of wider perspective, and Tom will provide that. And then look forward to the comments of our distinguished guests and professors, who will respond a little bit to Tom's initial remarks and then share some of their own ideas about this field. And then we'll have some time to open it up to the people here at the center, and also those joining us online are also invited to pose a question or make a comment. They'll be able to field as well. So thank you all very, very much. I'm sure this will be a great discussion. And again, really, Tom, appreciate very much you joining us today. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. And I'd like to thank you, Michael, for all the work you've done on Latin America over the years. You've been a voice of wisdom, one that many people turn to for a really sense of common sense, but deep insight and acuity about this region. So you mean a lot to the whole community. And I'd like to congratulate Diana and her colleagues on putting together this whole day of events and on your work on these topics. And glad to meet the panelists and look forward to the discussion. I only have a few minutes in the opening, but I want to at least give us a little bit of a framing. And I'm going to do so in a way that leads to 3 questions for our panelists. By the way, I didn't share these 3 questions with the panelists, so they can feel free to ignore them as they choose. There have been a lot of meetings on democratic backsliding in the last 10, even 15 years, but very, very few of them have the name rule of law in the title, which is a kind of an interesting question of why that's the case. Given that the connection between the 2 topics is so evident, it seems like one of the main strategies of overweening strongmen who are seeking to amass too much political power is to go after the judicial constraints on their power, because that's one of the things trying to hold them back. So one of the things they do is go after the courts in different ways. And so that's just one of the many connections between democracy and the rule of law that we feel. Yet the subject has not gotten the level of attention in the way that it's been framed here today and throughout the meetings this morning. And so I'm glad that we're doing it that way. Now, there was a very useful background paper that I know Diana and her colleague Simone are working on that tries to tease out the complex relationship between democracy and the rule of law. And I found it a very useful paper, and I'm looking forward to it becoming a published article, because there is a tendency among democracy analysts to make the simplistic assumption that democracy and the rule of law are really just 2 sides of the same coin. As endless meetings I have been in where people say you can't have democracy without the rule of law, and you can't have the rule of law without democracy. And that, everybody always nods their heads. Whereas this paper kind of shakes its head a little bit and says, no, wait a minute there. It's a little more complicated than that, which I appreciated. And I think it's one that we need to pay careful attention to this. And it highlights that there are things a leader can do to attack the rule of law that may not have much to do with democracy. There are things you can do to attack democracy that may not have much to do with the rule of law. And so it forces us to think harder. We sense the intimate connection between the 2, but as we push analytically, we see the differences that start to emerge. In Latin America, this connection has been there for many, many years. And if I permit me, I started my career in a newly formed office. I was at the State Department, but I was assigned over to USAID, an office to support democracy in Latin America. But the office was called the Office of Administration of Justice and Democratic Development. Administration of Justice was the rule of law. Democratic development was the other half. And on my first day in the job, I asked my boss, I said, how do I know which part's the administration of justice and which part's the democratic development? He said, oh, that's easy. Over on that side of the hallway, we have a few lawyers doing this administration of justice stuff, which I don't really understand because I'm not a lawyer. And over here, we have some democracy development folks, and they don't really talk to each other much because nobody can understand the lawyers, and the lawyers don't want to talk to anybody else. So it's simple, he said. He said, you're a lawyer, so you're on the left side of the hallway. So I was. So, but then my first assignment, I was sent to El Salvador to work on training a police unit. Kind of a ridiculous thing to ask a recent law school graduate to do. That was in order to try to reduce abuses of people that the police were trying to investigate for various kinds of human rights issues. And immediately the connection between the rule of law and the possibility of democracy in El Salvador was pretty evident to me in some fairly stark ways. And so we began trying within the office to talk across the hallway a little bit about the relationship between these things. But it was difficult because lawyers do tend to like to talk to lawyers. They would do things like, we need to update the judicial software that courts are using, and the democracy people would kind of tune out and say, oh, that's not democratic development. And lawyers do often speak in their own terms. They have their own preoccupations and isolate themselves, which is one reason why I think meetings on democratic backsliding rarely feature the rule of law, because of that. But over these decades, we have felt in Latin America the connection evolving between these two issues again and again. And, just in the last 10 years, we look and we think in Brazil during the period of backsliding under Bolsonaro, what was one of his main thrusts? The continual attack on the courts and the questioning of judicial power, which is, of course, such a huge issue in Brazil. We saw it in Bolivia in the late 2010s when Morales wanted a fourth term. What did he have to do? He had to convince the Constitutional Court to let him do that. How he did that is worth investigating. We see it in Mexico, where, late in his term, AMLO, what did he begin to pursue? A major program of, quote, judicial reform. In Guatemala, what has held back Guatemalan democratic governance for so long? The profound corruption of the elite power holders in Guatemala, the lack of the rule of law to hold these people accountable, and so forth. So we see throughout Latin America this intimate, evolving connection between the two. But then we see sometimes a puzzling kind of separation. If we look at El Salvador, many Salvadorans today say, I'm happy I have more rule of law. True, I have less democracy, but you know what? Given my choice, I'm going with the rule of law. And that's powerful. And that's something we need to pay attention to and not dismiss it and say, oh, well, they're confused or they're manipulated. There are differences in people's minds and lived experiences between the rule of law and democracy that we need to give greater attention to than I think democracy scholars often do. So that leads me to my first question. I'll speed up here for our panelists and others is, what is the evolving relationship in the country that you give the most attention to these two issues, and how help us understand in your particular case or areas of concern the way these two issues intersect? The second thing I'd like to bring up is democratic backsliding has been going on for 15 or 20 years. I date it actually to 2005. We could talk about that more later. Why are we still having conferences and workshops? Haven't we figured it out yet? What's wrong with this as a group of analysts and scholars? Why is it taking us so long? People outside my field, they hear I'm still writing on democratic backsliding. They're like, haven't you done that already? When do you get to the answers? So I've thought about, why is it taking us so long to get our arms around this topic, which is just steamrollering us in some way? I think there are several reasons. The first is that it requires this. It's like you've parted your hair on one side for many years, at least I have, and then suddenly you try to part it on the other side, and the hair doesn't go that way. We have a lot of built-in assumptions about democracy and democratization that are hard to go back on. We won't admit it to ourselves. We had a lot of deep naturalistic or teleological assumptions about once people get political freedom, they won't give it up. Once institutions are rooted, they won't become unrooted. Once there is pluralism in a society, it's very hard to unpluralize a society and so forth. We assumed these were kind of natural phenomena that once established were very hard to reverse. And And I think as North Americans, Americans in this country, we looked at other countries and said, well, that would never happen here because we're far down that naturalistic process. Well, we're discovering something different now, that institutions can be changed or uprooted, that pluralism can become less pluralistic, and so forth. So the first reason I think is we have some built-in defects in our thinking that have slowed us. The second is we've tended to underestimate it. You know, there's a saying about certain things happen slowly at first, then suddenly all at once. Backsliding is sometimes like that. You go along for a while and you think, this is troubling. This is definitely, there are signs of trouble. And then the bottom falls out of the situation. Think of Venezuela. For years, there were legitimate debates about Chavez. Is he really that anti-democratic? And there were many defenders of Chavez. And now, around the edges, there's some things, but he's doing a lot for the people and so forth. And then suddenly in the early 2010s, the bottom fell out of Venezuelan democracy in various ways. And you could look at other cases where we underemphasized, underestimated, and then suddenly we were hit with it. You could argue that's what's been happening in the United States. Is there are a lot of warning signs have been coming in our country of trouble politically, the hyperpolarization, the deformation of the information space, a lot of things. And then suddenly things speed up and you find you've underestimated what happened before. So that's a second reason. A third reason is that we've tended to grasp at single factor explanations and to think, oh, I have it. I have the explanation for the global wave of backsliding. It's because of people are using smartphones and going on social media and getting into information bubbles and polarizing themselves. It corresponds exactly with the rise of digital technology, democratic backsliding. That must be it. Or other people say, no, it's about democracies have been failing to deliver. And just in the last 20 years, inequality has been going up and countries are not producing the socioeconomic goods. Global capitalism is shaking. That must be it. Or other people say, no, it's the rise of the right and a new anti-progressive kind of ethos that has emerged. And people want the killer explanation. And there isn't one. It's too complicated. Why is backsliding happening in Israel? Why did it happen in Bangladesh? Why did it happen in Poland? Every one of those stories is very different and very complex. And that's true in the Latin American domain, where if you say democratic backsliding in Latin America, compare the case of Brazil in 2018 to 2022 with the case of Mexico in the last 5 years. It is a really difficult and complex comparison. The Bolsonaro phenomenon is very different from AMLO and what's been happening in Mexico. You can compare, but you'll have to find very deep differences, or compare what's happened in Nicaragua in the last 15 years to what happened in Bolivia off and on. Very different phenomenon, even if they're often ideological echoes or overtones that are similar. So that's why we've been so slow, I think, are these various reasons. But I'd turn to our panelists and say, are we on to backsliding where you're thinking about it? Are we paying enough attention? Are we missing things? And so forth. That leads me to my final question and comments. I'll be brief here, is Latin Americanists do, as Michael hinted at, they live within their world. Every region, I'm not a regional specialist, so I travel in different regionalist circles, and everyone thinks that they're unique and paying only attention to their region. They all do it. Don't worry, Michael. Arabists or Middle East scholars are exactly the same, Asianists and so forth. And Russian, oh my gosh, get Russian scholars together, you can only drink a certain brand of vodka, at the meeting and such. But Latin Americanists do. But this is an interesting moment for our Latin American colleagues, because as established democracies like the United States and some of its peers are facing a greater shakiness of democracy, there's a new receptivity in this country to learning from other countries. I see it at Carnegie in meetings that we do, and I see it in other places, journalists who call me. And for the first time, say, you've been studying democracy out there for a long time. Why is what's happening here happening? Give me some insights. People for the first time are interested. And there are things that Latin Americanists take for granted and know that are useful here. I'll name three. One of them is we're suddenly faced in the United States with kind of hyper-personalistic politics. And so Latin Americans say, caudillos, we know about caudillos. We've studied them. Well, we need to understand better in this country, what is intense personalization of politics? What are its forms? What's its trajectory? What tends to make it fade? And so forth. You know, there are some caudillos like Perón who were still living with Peronism almost a century later. There are others who come and go and you can't even remember their names. Americans in this country need to learn more about hyperpolarized personalist, hyper-personalistic politics and how that plays out and what it does to a system. Second, Americans have underappreciated the plasticity of political parties. In the last 50 years, we've tended to think of, we have a two-party system, well-established Democratic Party, Republican Party, it's not going to change much. But now, in the last 10 years, the Republican Party has profoundly changed to the extent that some Republicans feel orphaned, as they like to say. And we're sort of startled. How did, quote, one person, quote, take over such a major, well-institutionalized political party? Well, that's been happening in Latin America for years. Think of when, you know, in Brazil, when Collor emerged, people were like, who is this guy? He's good on television. What about the traditional people? Political parties in Latin America are often quite plastic, quite changing. And here in this country, we're unused to that. And we see somebody get elected in New York as mayor, and we think, wait a minute, is the Democratic Party about to undergo some attempted process of change in the same way that the Republican Party has? Or what's going on with our parties? We're rooted in very static thinking about political parties in this country, and Latin Americans are not in most cases. And then third, we don't have much experience in this country with parties moving from the center to the edges. The American party system has pulled parties to the center for decades and decades, and that's stopped happening, and it startled people because there's such powerful incentives to move to the center to try to get the centrist vote in this country. But that's now we feel one party has moved clearly to the edge of the political spectrum, and the other party is trying to decide its trajectory between a Mamdani kind of trajectory or something not like that. But in Latin America, many countries have been experiencing a movement from center right and center left to extreme right and extreme left. And they've learned, can that be contained within a democratic system? And what happens when that happens? And so another question for our Latin American colleagues is, you know, what kinds of thinking will be useful for North Americans that come out of the countries that you study, and be ready to be asked and to offer such advice. So that's a lot, but those are three issues that are on my mind: the relationship of democracy and the rule of law in the countries you study, why this has been such a difficult topic, and whether you think we're on it in the right way in the places you study, and what kind of lessons might emerge that would be useful to others. Thank you, Michael.
That was fantastic, Tom. Very great questions, very provocative. And why don't we turn to our commentators, and let's first turn to the Alvaro Santos, who's the lawyer and is the head of a center on the advancement of the rule of law at Georgetown Law School, and ask him for his comment. Alvaro unfortunately has another obligation, so he's going to have to leave a little bit early. So we're gonna give him the opportunity to get his reactions to that first question and the other two as well to get us started. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be in this panel. I share Michael's views. I want to echo them of how we've all benefited from your work, Tom. And so it's really great to have the opportunity to engage with you. I'm going to return the favor and instead ask a couple of questions that will serve also as maybe counterpoints or answers to some of what you asked. But so the first one has to do with this tendency you mentioned about looking for single explanations, right? And so you've engaged in a really interesting debate with Francis Fukuyama, Beatriz Magaloni, and Diaz Calleros, who responded to your article on misunderstanding democratic backsliding. And so the single explanation there would be economic, right? Like it is the dissatisfaction with economic liberalism that has produced democratic backsliding. And so in your response to them, you noticed that the United States seems to challenge, among other countries, seems to challenge that explanation because the U.S. Has continued to grow, and if you look at GDP per capita, it's actually done quite well when comparing with other countries, and yet you see this phenomenon of backsliding now in the U.S. And so I wanted to press a little bit, understanding, of course, that I think your comment about complexity and about not having one single explanation is really important. But if you disaggregate the analysis and you think about not national economic growth, but income distribution and inequality, right? So I'm thinking of the work of Branko Milanovic and World Income Inequality, his elephant chart, and basically they account for how in the last 25 years, the working class or middle class in the rich industrialized democracies, the US and Europe, have really suffered in the sense that their wages have stagnated or declined, right? And that experience of decline, dislocation, lack of social ascendancy, communities that have been decimated by outsourcing, and the phenomenon that I think is quite well known, that's fueling huge discontent, and the leaders, charismatic leaders, are taking advantage of that, right? So there's an interaction between demand side and supply side populism. On the left and on the right. So the left blames the 1% and the finance industry, and the right blames the developing countries like China or Mexico and migrants. But there's a grievance that's real, that it's about economic decline that you can't see on national statistics, but you can see once you disaggregate and look at economic inequality. And so I think that would be, my first question to you. The second is, and this was something that came up this morning, but like when we talk about democratic backsliding, we're kind of looking at perhaps many different dynamics against economic liberalism, right? Like they might come from many different ideological sources. And so if we change the lens a little bit, it'd be helpful perhaps to sort of think about what are the competing visions, political, ideological visions that are fighting for or vying for power vis-a-vis economic liberalism, right? That we can't get if we're just looking at changes in the democratic institutions, but there might maybe animating visions behind, and it's unclear, and there might be many that are competing, just as before there was communism and fascism and economic nationalism and so forth. And so what's your take on what happens if we change the lens to that? Can we gain some insight in what's happening now? And the third, in the relationship between democracy and the rule of law, one of the really striking realizations for me as a foreigner, I'm from Mexico, was that I understood the complicated and contradictory relationship of the United States abroad, right, in Latin America, in terms of both promoting democracy and also undermining democracy. But there was some idea that what was really valuable and exemplary of the United States was its home rule. What the US had done for itself in terms of democratic institutions. And in the last 16 years, it's been an incredibly sobering lesson to me, because I've learned a lot about US history. And so all of a sudden Trump is experienced as a unique phenomenon, but you learn about US history and you see echoes of Trump, across US history, right? And so there's something about US promoting democracy abroad that assumes that US democratic institutions are the model and are working well, right? And I think that perhaps this is a moment to challenge that idea. So you see that in, well, of course, the huge contradiction of the founding moment of the United States with all these very lofty universal liberal values, and at the same time, slavery as a huge institution. Then you see it in the regime of apartheid in the South that was really not dismantled until the 1960s, right? So you can't really talk about a modern democracy until the Civil Rights Act, when a huge part of the population was completely disenfranchised and violence was tolerated against African Americans and so forth. And then you have like the Japanese internment after World War II, massive deportations of Mexican Americans, and so all of a sudden, you don't have to go to Nazi Germany to understand what's going on now in terms of the huge sort of problems with rule of law and democracy. It looks very different, right? So maybe this is a humbling opportunity to also look in the United States and its history to understand these impulses that kind of come and go. This is not to deny that there's been enormous progress in the US, but I feel like there is some sense of a very sort of starry-eyed, idealized model of what we think the US has, and it's promoted abroad, even in its own institutions, right? Like if you look at the Supreme Court, how politicized it is. If you look at, the Electoral College, if you look at judicial review, another relationship between rule of law and democracy, it could be, it's a rule of law institution. It could be hugely anti-democratic. And so there's just like lots of different, I think, holes to poke and understand. And I don't see us doing that work. And I wonder whether we can learn from that as well.
Thanks, Salvador. I think since you're going to have to leave, I think maybe give Tom the opportunity to respond, and then we'll go to the other comments. Is that okay? Since I don't want you to run, and then
I appreciate it, I'm
okay.
really grateful.
The reason why I like Alvaro and Tom is that both of them communicate with non-lawyers, so I'm very grateful for that. Tom?
Thank you, Alvaro. Those are very thoughtful questions and comments. I don't want to take too much time because I want to give the others a chance. So let me just briefly focus on your first and third particularly. Yeah, this debate over is economic malaise really at the heart of backsliding is deep and complicated. In the last election this year in Norway is a country that takes care of its citizens pretty well. If you want to have a happy life, try being born in Norway, at least socioeconomically. It's cold, but this year, the illiberal right-wing party doubled its vote to become, I think, the second biggest vote getter in Norway. It wasn't about economic malaise. Norway's in pretty good shape with all that oil and gas. Something else is going on. The average Trump voter in 2016 against Hillary Clinton was wealthier than the average Hillary Clinton voter. Poorer people in the country still are voting for Democrats more than Republicans. The oil executive in Dallas who loves Trump, the tech bro in Menlo Park who loves Trump, the investment banker in New York who loves Trump, the wealthy farmer in Nebraska who loves Trump, they're not hurting economically. They love Trump. People love Trump for a lot of different reasons. It isn't just a restless, unhappy middle class that has seen some of its jobs outsourced to China or Mexico and other places. Something bigger is going on. And so that's where I think the left side of the political spectrum here has really fallen short, because they've been stuck on the economic explanation. And you saw this in the Biden years. If we can just deliver economically and get people this benefit or that benefit, they're going to love us. They didn't love Joe Biden for a lot of different reasons, actually. And they didn't love Kamala Harris enough to get her across the finish line. And so I think there is something bigger in the anti-progressive pushback in a lot of North American and European countries that we need to pay attention to. And so reducing it down to the malaise of the working class is missing something bigger. And I worry that's that. And then if you go further out to other cases that I mentioned in my debate with Frank and others, is, you look at Israel. Israel has had a miracle economy in the last 15 years. People write books about, Israel's tech miracle and so forth. It's backsliding because of the rise of the religious right. The religious right isn't asserting itself because of economic malaise. It's an identity fight. Poland had the second highest growth rate in the world between 1990 and 2020 after China. And it was the second biggest backslider in Central Europe. Why? You can't get any better than the Polish economy if you want to have an emerging economy. Yet it was the country that fell backwards so much. So that's where I'm trying to push us. Like, it's easy just to think, oh, that's it. It's that economic dissatisfaction. Something more things are going on deeper. That's my answer to that. On your question about, isn't this a moment for the U.S. to reconsider its sort of status as a democracy promoter? No, it's not the moment. It's 10, 20, or 30 years past the moment. I wrote an article in 1994 in Dissent magazine, which nobody reads, so you can't find it, called Promoting Democracy in a Postmodern World. And I described a scene, actually it was 1997, sorry, I described a scene where I was in Kazakhstan. I went with NDI on a mission to help the Kazakh parliament rewrite its electoral law. And I was meeting with the head of the parliament who was in charge of the legislation. And I say in the article, he looked at me, the visiting American expert, and he said, I want our parliament to be just like the US Congress. And I said, 3 words came screaming into my mind. No, you don't. The US Congress is a god-awful mess in all kinds of ways, from lobbying on through to dysfunction of all other kinds of sorts. But it was the 90s, and he assumed America had a model. We had won the Cold War. We seemed to be on a roll. People liked Bill Clinton, both in the US and around the world. There was a self-confidence about globalization. So there was a sense of the wind of history, at the back of the liberal democratic model. And so there was a kind of mythic idea that American democracy promoters, I called it in another article, a high school civics version of American democracy that didn't include a chapter on, corrupt lobbying. It didn't include a chapter on, what was American democracy like before 1964 and the Civil Rights Act and other things. There was a kind of mythic view, but people bought it because of American success. And when you went abroad, people said, yeah, we do want to be like you. What they really meant was we want to have a nice life like you. They weren't really sure what all that entailed, but it was like you're holding out something. But that began to fade a lot in stages. So I did an article in 2017 called The Chastened Superpower after the election of Donald Trump, in which a colleague, Francis Brown, and I talked about this fact that how do you promote democracy in the world when your own democracy is in serious trouble? And we said the field is trying to make a transition from vertical learning to horizontal learning. Horizontal being the United States learn from others, others might learn from the US, that it's democracy support should be like an open workshop among all people concerned, not a teaching seminar where somebody has answers and somebody has questions. But the institutions that carry out democracy promotion are not very well designed for that. They're not allowed to work on the United States. They're not allowed to really do work that draws upon American problems and experiences very much, or not really to dig into the American side. And so they're sort of stuck like an antenna that only broadcasts out. It doesn't broadcast in. And so the way we designed the institutions was the old vertical learning model, and we haven't been able to think about how to change democracy support to make it a very different conversation. So you're absolutely right, but we've been sort of, in a sense, in this conversation for a long time, but it's proving difficult to realize. But now the yellow lights flashing have turned to red lights flashing in this country. And so, it is no longer plausible, I think, at this point for, an American to go abroad and say, I have a shiny model that, would be good for you. They can say, we have problems and we're struggling. We still have valuable institutions. We're struggling. We'd like to hear about what you're doing. We could learn from you. Maybe you could learn from our problems as well as things that we've done right. But we're now in a situation where what you say is sort of more than true. So.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Alvaro. Well, I have to scratch Norway off my list and possible places to move. I didn't realize it was that serious there, but anyway, it reminds me a little bit of the, equivalent happened with the financial crisis of 2008, whereas all the Latin Americans said, we always thought the financial crisis happened in Latin America, not in the United States. And we always thought, now, whatever our criticisms of the United States, it knew how to manage its fiscal affairs. And obviously that was completely destroyed in 2008. And I think the equivalent has happened in the political democracy realm as well. Why don't we turn to Janice to add a few comments, and we'll collect from you, and then go to Nico, and then go to Lorenzo, and then get Tom's response to the three of you.
Great.
Janice?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? It's an honor to be here. It's such an honor to be to meet you after many years of reading your work, and to see colleagues and people I've admired for a really long time. Thanks so much for inviting me to be here. So I also am a non-lawyer, and I talk to lawyers, and it's often an awkward conversation. I co-published an article with Jorge Contese, who some of you might know, who works on the Inter-American system. And the article, half of it is about the beauty of Mexican jurisprudence, how it's cited internationally, especially kind of the elevation of international law to the status of above the Mexican constitutions. The first half of the article is a really kind of almost an artistic rendering of how beautiful and artful and innovative and polished Mexican jurisprudence is. And then I come in and talk about the over 99% impunity in cases of disappearances, and kind of in the human reality of what it is to live, what it has been to live in Mexico, especially since 2006 and the declaration of the war on drugs there. So I think it was really interesting to start to write that article, and to kind of really think about what goes wrong, what has gone wrong in Mexico in terms of the rule of law, democracy, and I would add a third into what I'm going to say, human rights. Right? I think human rights and rule of law we sometimes think about as co-varying, right, as necessarily going the same direction, and I think that's actually not always true, and I'll talk a little bit about it. So, trying not to go too deep, but I want to kind of give a quick historical rendering of how I see what's happened in Mexico since 2000, and humbly, I'm sure there's Mexicans and Mexicanists in the room, but just to kind of go quickly, I think civil society thought in 2000 that with the arrival of democracy, we were going to have democracy thriving, we were going to have human rights thriving, we were going to have rule of law thriving, right? By solving the electoral problem, by finally having elections with integrity, all three were going to go up, right? And it didn't, right? Vicente Fox, who's elected in 2000, it's okay, right? But I think by the end of his term, there were real signs of a weakening of the rule of law, right? This is the time when Mexican cartels are becoming more powerful, where kind of the violence is starting to happen. The always uneven federal Mexican system is showing signs of crisis, right? And so there's Mexicans lean into democracy. We have clean elections in 2006, elect Calderon. And I don't know how to talk about what happens with rule of law next, right? So in some ways, can we think that mano dura is a strengthening of the rule of law? Or do we think about it as a weakening of the rule of law, right? So it's Calderon sends the military to the streets, and tries to exert, there's different renditions of what happens next, right? But tries to exert monopolistic use of force, at least in some of the areas where that had been contested. But what's very certain is that human rights rapidly deteriorate, right? We have kind of the emerging of the crisis of both homicides and disappearances. Ciudad Juarez becomes the most dangerous city in the entire world in 2010, right? So we have kind of unprecedented lethal violence. So unprecedented degrading of, at least unprecedented in terms of kind of recent Mexican history, degrading of human rights. I think that really erodes Mexicans' hope for what democracy can deliver. So much so that in 2012, who do they turn to? They turned to the PRI, right? The PRI, the anti-democratic party that had presided over one-party rule since the 1920s, returns to power. So it's a real rejection of democracy and a hope that there can be, I would say, primarily that something can be done about the dire human rights situation. If we just put the kind of anti-democratic party back in power, can they reestablish what seemed like rule of law, or at least minimum respect for the value of human life? But what happens under Peña Nieto? We have, I think by however we measure it, right? He leans into the mano dura, but it doesn't work, right? We don't have the state regaining territory. We have the human rights situation deteriorating, and an even deeper disillusionment with human rights. And I think in that way, it's pretty unsurprising that what comes next is a formal retreat from at least vertical accountability, at least horizontal accountability, right? So AMLO's elected, things in terms of rule of law, in terms of human rights are fairly dire. So what does he do? He says, you know what? It's time to take away one of the pillars of democracy, which is horizontal accountability. At the same time, and I know this is probably an unpopular opinion in this crowd, I think as somebody who I've been working since 2010 with the families of people who are disappeared in Mexico, who again and again and again are frustrated by unresponsive and unaccountable investigators, prosecutors, and judges. It's a pretty desperate situation in terms of the lack of vertical accountability. And I think I think there's a calculation to a certain extent among many people. So we're giving up horizontal accountability, but maybe we'll actually get some vertical accountability, because what we had was that judges were not doing their job. Prosecutors weren't doing their job. Investigators and police are not doing their jobs. So I think it's too early to say it hasn't worked. I think it's still up in the air, but I think to me, that explains a little bit of kind of where we are. And I think Sheinbaum has gone down the same route. Really quickly to the other two. So I think are we in a period of democratic backsliding in Mexico? I actually wouldn't. I think it's mixed, not to take the easy way out, but I think there's clear democratic backsliding in terms of pointing to the judicial reform. But I actually think the mobilization of the victims, as well as other social movements, they are finding spaces for participation and for concrete change, which we should feel really good about in terms of pushing for the respect of human rights and for rule of law. So I think there are some openings there. Finally, lessons. I got tenure a couple years ago. My project now is called Enforced Disappearances in the United States, Lessons from Latin America. I think if we look at what's happening right now, ICE should be, considered a paramilitary force in many ways. I think when we look at the deportations to Secot in El Salvador, when people we have deported are in that prison, we do not know if they're alive or dead. We have no way of knowing their fate. Those, to me, are enforced disappearances. What does Latin American experience teach us about those? They teach us that you have to resist, you have to independently document those cases, and you have to contradict the state narratives which are systematically criminalizing those who are being disappeared. So I think there's, unfortunately, a lot of experience and a lot to learn from those movements.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Janice. We're going to turn now to Nicolas. Nicolas is from Argentina, but teaches now in CIDE in Mexico, and he's going to speak in Spanish, and Denise will translate. But Nicolas, por favor, tiene la palabra.
Bueno, gracias por las preguntas, por la invitación. Y el tema es muy amplio, así que creo que el punto de partida es mostrar el recorte de donde voy a hablar para hacer mi respuesta. Y a mí me gustaría hablar de la relación entre democracia, leyes, instituciones y movimientos sociales.
So,
Y
Thank you.
Sorry.
It's a very broad topic. So I will be talking about the relationship between democracy, law, and institutions, social movements.
en especial movimientos juveniles y estudiantiles universitarios. América Latina tiene un campo muy grande en el estudio de juventudes y movimientos estudiantiles en distintos países y tiene una red de investigación muy amplia en torno a esos temas.
So in particular, it's youth movement in universities. Latin America has a very wide range of youth movement in universities and studies of these regional movements in universities.
En ese campo de estudio siempre decimos que cuando hablamos de jóvenes y movimientos estudiantiles, no tenemos que caer en dos posiciones, que son dos posiciones que no ayudan a pensarlos de las ciencias sociales. Uno es romantizarlos y el otro es estigmatizarlos.
So when we're talking about youth movement, we should not be caught in the trap of either romanticizing them or stigmatizing them.
Bueno, yo creo, hoy hablaban de la plasticidad de la idea de democracia. Yo creo que con la democracia es algo parecido en el debate. No hay que caer ni en una idealización de la democracia ni en una estigmatización de la misma.
So we were talking about earlier the plasticity of political parties. I think the same thing should be in the case of democracy. You shouldn't fall in the trap of either idealizing democracy or romanticizing it.
Bueno, entonces creo que la pregunta que hay que hacerse en este tema es ¿de qué hablamos cuando hablamos de democracia? Y sobre todo una pregunta que hoy se hacían en la mañana, ¿a qué sectores representa la democracia, ¿no?
So the question is, what are we talking about when we're talking about democracy, and what sectors does democracy represent?
Bueno, ese tema es muy amplio, por eso yo valoro mucho que haya enfoques interdisciplinarios de distintos campos de las ciencias sociales, pero a mí me gustaría mostrar un debate vinculado a una cuestión importante en América Latina, que es qué son las universidades en América Latina y qué es una universidad democrática, y eso relacionarlo con el papel de los movimientos estudiantiles.
So I really appreciate the interdisciplinary focus on this topic, but I'm going to focus on what are universities in Latin America and how they are related to the democratic movement and the youth movements within universities.
Por ejemplo, si uno ve una institución que agrupa a las universidades de América Latina, que es la Unión de Universidades de América Latina y del Caribe, y ve que esa institución que reconoce como una universidad democrática, aparecen los siguientes valores. Primero, que es una universidad pública. Segundo, que es una universidad gratuita. Tercero, que es una universidad cogobernada, o sea que los distintos sectores, estudiantes, profesores, trabajadores, forman parte del gobierno de la universidad. Y por último, que es una universidad autónoma, que puede dictarse sus propias leyes y el gobierno no tiene capacidad de intervenir en la misma.
So if you look at what the Union Universities from Latin America and the Caribbean considers a democratic university, there are several characteristics. It's public, it's free, it's co-governed, including students in their government bodies, and it's autonomous to make its own decisions.
Bueno, obviamente los distintos países de América Latina tienen sus propias leyes universitarias que reconocen esos principios, algunos más que otros, no todos son iguales, pero ahora voy a generalizar. Y lo que yo quería mostrar es que estas leyes universitarias, que obviamente se traducen en instituciones, no surgen de cualquier lugar, sino que justamente son producto de movilizaciones estudiantiles que se dieron a lo largo del siglo XX en América Latina y también en el siglo XXI en la actualidad. Y por ejemplo, para decir algo más, si uno ve hoy el discurso de Javier Milei en Argentina, es un discurso que tiene a la universidad como fuentes de críticas y sobre todo le molestan estos principios universitarios.
So each country in the region has its own individual laws for universities, and he wants to talk about and argue that the different laws emerge from the different youth movements in the different countries, and that for somebody like Javier Milei in Argentina, the university has become essential to his contesting of how these universities are organized.
Y si uno ve el papel de los movimientos estudiantiles en el siglo XX, y lo hago muy resumido, y ve sus principales protestas, digo protestas que fueron masivas y se repitieron en distintos países de América Latina. Por ejemplo, uno toma la primera mitad del siglo XX, que esto hablé hoy a la mañana, Y hay distintas protestas estudiantiles en distintos países de América Latina que logran justamente la autonomía y el cogobierno universitario.
So if you look at the role of protests of youth in the 20th century in different countries, they were massive. In particular, I want to talk about what happened in Argentina in the first half of the 20th century that really had this idea of a democratic university emerge in that country.
Eso se pierde con las dictaduras militares del Cono Sur, también con varias de las dictaduras de Centroamérica. Pero después si uno ve, sobre todo los años 80 en América Latina, también hay otras protestas que se dan simultáneamente en distintos países de América Latina, estudiantiles, que logran recuperar justamente la democracia dentro de las universidades, la autonomía y el cogobierno.
So that was lost, that independence that was gained in the beginning of the 20th century was lost during the dictatorships in the South Cone and in Central America. But you see a resurgence of these massive protests that were region-wide in the 80s, and they were able to recover some of these values of democratic universities that were established at the beginning of the 20th century.
En esos años 80 y 90, también en distintos países de América Latina, hay muchas protestas estudiantiles dentro de las universidades públicas para no permitir la privatización de esas universidades. Por ejemplo, hoy hablan de no me acuerdo si la nombraron a la presidenta de México, sí a López Obrador, pero hoy la actual presidenta de México es Claudia Sheinbaum y ella participaba en un movimiento estudiantil de los años 80 que era el Consejo Estudiantil Universitario, que justamente fue un movimiento estudiantil que no permitió que implementen cuotas de inscripción en la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México.
So in the 80s and 90s, many of these protests were fighting against the privatization of universities. And Claudia Sheinbaum, who's now the president of Mexico, participated in this protest in the 80s, where students were contesting the quotas that were established in the public university in Mexico.
Bueno, y si uno va en este panorama muy general al siglo XXI y ve el discurso que tienen estas universidades también nos dicen que están comprometidas con los derechos humanos y en contra de distintas formas de violencia.
And so if you look at the discourse to the 21st century, you see these universities that are committed to support human rights and against violent action.
Y nuevamente, por ejemplo, se conoce que un gran movimiento social en América Latina en las primeras décadas del siglo XXI fue el movimiento feminista. Pero el movimiento feminista no solamente se dio a nivel general, sino que también tuvo protestas particulares dentro de las universidades. Y hoy las universidades de América Latina tienen un conjunto de políticas en contra de la violencia de género que justamente vienen a raíz de esas protestas estudiantiles.
And you see specifically the feminist movement within the first years of the 21st century. And it was all over the region where they were able to establish politics to enforce gender equity within the public system university across Latin America.
Bueno, para ir cerrando, con todos estos ejemplos, ¿qué quiero decir? Que si uno ve una institución que se considera como democrática en América Latina, paradigmática por excelencia, son las universidades públicas. Y los pilares y los principios que tiene como ideario democrático no surgieron de cualquier lugar, sino que justamente vienen de movilizaciones sociales y estudiantiles.
So if you think about which institutions in Latin America, and to close, represent these ideals of democratic values, he argues that public universities represent this and embody democratic values, and these values came out of youth movements throughout the last century and the current century.
Y para cerrar, la gran pregunta es, uno si hoy analiza las matrículas de las universidades en América Latina, sobre todo yo soy sociólogo, la de sociología están cayendo estrepitosamente, ¿no? Pero todas las matrículas universitarias, los jóvenes, muchos jóvenes están tomando como opción en las universidades, como su carrera profesional a futuro. Entonces creo que la gran pregunta que queda y la quiero dejar abierta es, ¿por qué una institución democrática por excelencia como la Universidad Latinoamericana, que incluso se veía como un vehículo de ascenso social, hoy en día no está siendo una opción para muchos jóvenes que la siguen viendo muy lejana, ¿no? A pesar de todos estos principios que tiene?
And if you look at, it's a contradiction because it's one of the most democratic institutions, universities, but if you look at enrollment, particularly in sociology, which is my profession, enrollment has been steeply declining throughout the years. And so I ask why this like example of democracy and a vehicle for progress is something that students see so difficult to attend and it's to attain, sorry, and it's no longer a social option for them.
Great. Muchas gracias, Nicolás. Why don't we turn now to Kenzo for his thoughts or questions, and then we'll open it up. We'll get Tom's response, or we'll open it up and then get Tom's, can wrap it up and respond to other questions as well. Kenzo?
Hi. So, do you want economic development? Become an Asian dictatorship. I'm not talking about China. I'm talking about South Korea during the 70s when it was a US-supported dictatorship. We could talk about Singapore. We could talk about Vietnam. And it's always funny because now we think about Turkey as this nationalist authoritarian regime with elections. But do you really know about the Japanese democracy, about the Japanese judiciary systems, how they rewrite history books about Imperial Japan during the Second World War? And we could keep talking more about the economic development of India right now. It's an authoritarian regime with remarkable economic development. So I really think it's interesting, your provocation. But at the same time, I think we have to think about, look, economic development. So a second generation Latino immigrant in the US has has a better salary and a better income than the average German citizen, right? Is his life better than the average German? He has a better health care. He lives in a better city. Okay, he can buy a better car for sure and cheaper, but he has a better education for free. He has public universities for free. I don't think so. So sometimes we have to think how economic development is the measure of progress for most of the population. Argentina is in a permanent economic crisis for the last 20 years almost. It still has a better human development index position, close to some European countries, than Brazil, that in the last 20 years had the better economic growth since the 70s. Brazil still has huge parts of its population that are more closer to Africa than to Argentina or Uruguay. So Poland had 9% of economic growth in the last 20 years. I don't know, I'm not sure about the data, but it's something like that. France had almost like 10. It's a stagnant economy. Still, most of them immigrants, where they go in Europe? They go to Warsaw or they go to Paris. So I think there's this debates about how people perceive progress and economic development and progress in their lives. Okay, think about Brazil. So I always like to mention the German philosopher Walter Benjamin, who said that all progress is also barbarism, right? So we think about democracy in Brazil. It's a democracy that has taken people from fome, hambre, como se dice, hambre? Hunger, yes. They were starving. Now they are not starving anymore. But we still kill 50,000 people by gunshots every year. And the Works Party government, Lula government, never made any difference in this specific issue. The Works Party conducted the same militarization policy of public security, of public safety, and I don't think in Mexico is really different than the previous governments. So what progress are we talking? People has better wages. They still are afraid to lose their lives if they live in the wrong neighborhoods. That are the majority of neighborhoods in Brazil, by the way. So I think these are some of the contradictions of democracy that cannot be resumed to economic development. But also I think Europe has another dimension. What's the problem of Europe? Is the terrifying idea that there is a demographic tendency that at some point in the near future, Europe will not be a white and Christian continent. It's the revenge of the Moors, of the Muslims. Right, this is, I mean, and okay, we have, of course, we don't sympathize with AfD, with the German same, I can't say it's a Nazi party, I don't know. Anyway, but I can understand the crisis of identity of a population who thinks it's not my country anymore, you know? I can understand this huge contradiction of an European identity that must understand if it's possible to be European and be no white and maybe no Christian. So let's come back to Latin America, because that's our specialty. So, really interesting, the relations between social movements, judiciary systems, and democracy. The same Supreme Court in Brazil that now has condemned former President Bolsonaro to prison was basically the Supreme Court, basically almost the same composition. The previous has condemned our President Lula to prison a few years ago. So the same people that now celebrate, they have memes, they have T-shirts with the portrait, the picture of the Supreme Court judges, were the people that 5 years ago were talking about lawfare, judiciary activism, new kind of hybrid wars where the US supports coups through the judiciary system. It's really interesting. I'm talking about real people that I know. So, I think this is interesting, the connection between judiciary, democratic backslashing, and this new concept. So I think this is also a contradiction. But there is this huge problem in Brazil about law, that is the perception that the law in democracy protects this elite, this minority of people that has strongly deep connections with the state. And in a country where people don't feel they are protected by law in general, they don't support human rights because they consider human rights a privilege. That's terrifying, but most people in favelas in Rio de Janeiro supported the action in the last month where the police killed 120 people. But what's more terrifying, and I would say sad, is that the most people that most support this action don't think this action is going to change anything. They don't think that killing people will solve the problem of the organized crime control of these neighborhoods, of these territories. But they still supported this kind of action because they say at least they are trying to do something about it. So this is a really tough conditions to build a democracy and to say to people, no, democracy works. It's important to defend democracies. Of course, the generations that have the memory of how it was to live under a dictatorship, they don't want the return of the dictatorships. But every poll, since we become a democracy again, since the 80s, every poll that we do, every data that we have, every year, the trust on democratic institutions in Brazil is decreasing. It didn't start now. If you see the historical series from the 90s, young people, every new generation believes less in institutional democracies and in democratic institutions than the previous generation. This is a real challenge because I think democracies demands democratic cultures, and we must renovate the democratic pact, because one basic question is, what are the incentives for youth people in Latin America believe that the democracy works for them, and that therefore they must defend democracies against authoritarian turns. I was talking about Asian dictatorships, and one thing that I think it's really important is to think how China is becoming a new model of alternative model of development and society for many people in developing countries. Maybe in the US, people don't think China could be a model, but for many people in Africa, in Latin America, and in Southeast Asia, there is like this huge number of Brazilian YouTubers who are starting to make kind of soft propaganda about how China is safe. You don't have the risk to be assaulted in the streets of China, how everybody has works, they work really hard. But you know what? The average Chinese worker earns more money than the average Brazilian worker nowadays. And so maybe I think for middle class who has the full democratic rights, it don't looks like a good deal. But for people starving in the streets, why not? Oh, I'm going to lose my right to vote. Yeah, but you have food, house, no. So this trade-off, this trade-offs between economic safety and democracy, I really understand why for some people it makes sense. Okay, so a lot of questions. No, I have no answers to that. Okay, one last thing that I think it's a good provocation. The problem with organized crime and the judiciary systems that we were talking earlier this morning is also how much of the judiciary systems nowadays are infiltrated by organized crime in Latin American countries. This is a fundamental dimension. How can you consider that you are in a democratic regime when not Supreme Courts, but when many levels of the judiciary systems are part of and also of the state security systems and also the financial capital, with all these different institutions are now being basically in progressively a more open and clear way being controlled by organized crime factions. But at the same time, how we can protect our sovereignty? Because to conclude with this idea, one thing that I think it's really dangerous is that now in the national security debate in the US is starting to make the fusion between the idea of terrorism and drug dealers. People are hitting with drones boats in Venezuela. So in Brazil, last 2 weeks ago, the main political result of the police Operation Rio was that the far-right Congress people were trying to approve in the Brazilian law the concept that organized crime is a terrorist organization, what would open space for US intervention. So we are discussing the Plan Colombia in this morning. People are trying to open space for a Plan Brazil in our National Congress 2 years ago. So I think this is a main challenge for democracy. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Kenzo. If it's okay with Tom, I'd like to take maybe a couple of questions and then return to you for final comments. So please just tell us, yes, in the back, please just wait for the mic. Tell us who you are and try to be as concise as possible so we can fit in as many questions. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Graham Worsbicky. I'm a freshman in the business school. Today marks almost exactly 1 year since the protests in South Korea following the president attempting to declare martial law. I think in those protests, you saw a lot of youth engagement, whereas in the recent No Kings protests in America, you saw very little youth engagement. So I was wondering why what explains that disparity?
Thank you very much. And model concision, I like that. Anybody else? If I'm not, no? Any other questions? No? And nothing online, right? Alice, you wanna, and then we'll go back to Tom.
Thank you. Really appreciate all of your comments and starting us off. So you began speaking about rule of law and then how that's not necessarily correlated with democracy. And then we kind of transitioned over time to talking more about specific cases of movements, including student movements. So I'm just curious how you're seeing, Tom, civil society now and the role of movements and whether that's shifted with democracy building or how you see changes and backsliding over the last 20 years. And also how you're seeing civil society, whether you see distinctions of certain aspects growing and how you're seeing the role of movements like the ones that our guests have talked about shifting over the years. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Let me just ask Tom a question. I'm just curious to know your thoughts about this. I guess the most common reaction I get from friends in Latin America when they're seeing what's happening here is why they're struck that there's such a little reaction and such a weak reaction. And they just kind of find it hard to quite understand that they were expected. I mean, you had the No Kings as was mentioned, but just given what's happening, how there's been little response. And one of the explanations that people say is, well, because there's no experience in the United States with authoritarianism and this is something new, and so people don't know how to respond. Whereas in Latin America, there's been a lot more history, there's a lot more experiences. I wonder if you accept that explanation and if you have any thoughts about that. I'm sorry, was there another question? I'm sorry, I didn't see you. I'm sorry, you're blocked by, sorry.
I was at UNGA last year and we were sitting with Club of Madrid and the former president of OAS was in the room with other former presidents. And he said something that was very interesting, that he said, as long as rule of law is not completed or fulfilled in Latin America, then human rights, that he just put it as like rule of law is always going to be first, and then the pursuit of human rights or development is going to be second. And I just wanted to hear any reaction to that. And because that's what social movements are trying to achieve, is human rights and self-determination. But without rule of law, then he kind of said it's impossible.
Okay, thanks. Did I miss anybody else, or I was just you? Okay, Tom, let you have the final word.
Okay. Well, turning to your question first, Michael, yeah, I get the same question a lot when I speak abroad, either online or in person. People say there's less reaction than I would expect in the United States. In the first place, I'd say that there is a lot of reaction. It's in different sectors and takes different forms. There's a lot of legal reaction. There's a lot of pushback on the legal front, many lawsuits across many different domains. There's been a reaction in universities to some extent, of universities pushing back, some law firms. If you go sector by sector, the media has been quite, I would say unbridled for the most part. There have been attempts to intimidate the media, but I don't think they've worked. And the No Kings protest was significant. It was millions of people, and it was significant. But I know what you mean in that there isn't the single big thing in the national capital where people say, that's it, the moment has arrived. Partly that's because it's been a very iterative process, unlike South Korea, where there was a very sharp moment. Martial law, that's it. This has been a salami slicing, process of lots and lots of cuts of different types. And partly because the US is a more decentralized country, both sort of physically and psychologically, and we don't have the sort of French tradition of you go to Paris and you protest in the street, and you have a national protest. Washington, D.C. is the capital, but there's a lot of other major cities and you have protests. And so a lot of our protests are quite decentralized, and you don't feel them in the national way that you do in some other countries. And so I think there are a series of things, and I think the United States, it does have a tradition of protests around some issues like the civil rights movement or the Vietnam War, or, you can look back in our history and see some very significant protest movements. They were around kind of more focused issues, whereas this process is somewhat diffuse, I think, as I said, and has different parts to it. So those are all maybe parts of an answer, but maybe not a satisfactory one. But I think I wouldn't give up and say, that's it. The United States has just sort of fallen on its back and is not doing anything in response to pushes against institutions and norms. I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think all the questions, well, let me just specifically on the last question about rule of law and human rights and so forth, that goes back to an old and lively debate over kind of sequencing, and do you need to first get the rule of law and then you can get democracy and rights? I've never been a big fan of that argument because it's not clear to me if you say to a country, okay, a bad government has just fallen, that people want elections, and to elect somebody, say, no, wait, hold on for 30 or 40 years till you get the rule of law, just put that on hold. That's just not going to be very satisfactory, and you also can't guarantee that's going to happen. And you do need pluralism and other elements of democracy to help bring along parts of the rule of law. So the idea, this dream of almost a technocratic vision that you can first get the rule of law really working almost like a machine, and then human rights and democracy can unfold, I just don't think corresponds to reality. But there's a broader issue, which I want to come back to what you said, which I thought was very interesting at the end about Mexico and mobilization in the context of what some see as backsliding, in which it causes some doubt in our mind about, well, wait a minute, the mobilization is pro-democratic in many ways, yet in a context of that. This is a very central issue because inside the trend, either inside or alongside the trend of democratic backsliding of the last 20 years, is another very important trend of increased societal mobilization in a lot of countries. all over the world. You know, at Carnegie, we have something called the Global Protest Tracker, which tries to keep track of all active anti-government protests in the world. And we've been doing this for 7 years now. And there's clearly a organic, secular, whatever you want to call it, trend towards more and more protest mobilization in the world. It has to do with a lot of things, rising expectations, greater communications technology that allows people to organize, a series of things, a reaction to democratic backsliding in some cases. But what's hard is you sort of think maybe we're missing the picture. We're so focused on the backsliding, maybe that's actually the reactive trend to the mobilization, rather than the mobilization being the reactive trend to the backsliding. And at a minimum, they're certainly in competition with each other. So you look at a case like Bangladesh or Nepal in the last year or two. Bangladesh had very big mobilization, which startled everyone by throwing out a government that seemed to be, or authoritarian government, deeply entrenched. Nepal has thrown out a government. They chose a new government on Discord, on the platform. They you know, this is, the big things are going on with mobilization in a lot of countries. Yet the democratic trajectory of those countries is very, very uncertain. Bangladesh is struggling to make it work. Nepal will struggle. Madagascar had very big mobilization that caused a president to resign, but then military stepped in promising a transition. And so there are a lot of stories of major mobilization there going on that are actually, in a way, kind of the key story. And so I think we have to be careful as we talk about democratic backsliding, not to discount mobilization and to think, well, that's just kind of like the fever of the patient, you know, and the patient has a sickness which is called backsliding, and the result is a kind of fever of mobilization. There's, you know, across the last 50 to 70 years, authoritarianism has been pushed out in lots and lots of places by citizens who want more voice. That's in a way a bigger trend, and it hasn't really gone away, even though there's a lot of backsliding happening. So I guess I'd close with that thought, Michael.
Thank you. Could I ask one question? One final question. Why 2005? Because you left it hanging.
Oh yeah, why does backsliding start in 2005? Yeah. A couple of important things occurred that year. One, Vladimir Putin decided, it was sort of up in the air which way people thought he might go in Russia. And in that year, he pursued an NGO law that really started to show his true intentions. People in the early 2000s thought Putin might be a economic reformer and then a political reformer. And in that same year in Ethiopia, and a generation of some of the other leaders who are called the sort of the new, whatever, I can't remember what this moniker they went under, began to show their colors and began kicking out democracy promoters in their country and pushing back and closing down. In South America, you know, I'd say Venezuela underwent through some key things around that time, as well as a couple of other places. And you can look back, it isn't as though there's just one particular moment, but that was the year when evidence started really clearly gathering. Although, you know, I wrote an article back in Foreign Affairs in 1997 called Democracy Without Illusions, at the height of the enthusiasm. Of course, you can count on me to rain on the parade, in which I said, yes, it looks good, but there are a lot of clouds on the horizon, because a lot of people out there are not getting what they want out of democracy. There's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of other things. And we should be careful, and we should realize that democracy seems to be the historical moment for it, but trouble is coming. And it came. So the backsliding is part of the democratization trend. You know, it's all interlinked. It isn't just a few bad guys who suddenly decided to go down a bad direction. But that's why I usually choose 2005 in my mind. There was enough evidence that year you could begin to say that. I wrote an article that year in Foreign Affairs called the global pushback against democracy promotion that year. And it was the first thing people were like, what do you mean? We're running wild in the world, having a good time. I said, no, people are turning on you, saying, we don't want these people in our country, because they're trying to get control again over our systems. And so that I crystallized it in an article that year.
Thanks. That's very, very helpful and very interesting. I thought maybe it was because of something happened in technology that year that kind of, you know, smartphone was after that. Anyway, this has been absolutely terrific and really stimulating. And I want to thank our great commentators and panelists, and give a special thanks to my friend Tom Crothers, who's really, it's been a real treat to listen to you, and you've given us a lot to think about, and really appreciate you joining us and sharing your incredible knowledge and the sort of the breadth of your understanding of this issue and the depth of it really has been fantastic. So, and thank you all for coming. Please join me in thanking Tom and our great panelists.